Welcome to Social and Political Philosophy. My name is Mark Thorsby, and this course overviews the basics of Western political philosophy. Today, we're going to be giving an introduction. I'm going to be giving an introduction on the Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes. Now, the Leviathan's an incredibly important work, and there's lots of things to say about it. I obviously cannot say all of those things in this video. There's really sort of four moments that I want to focus on in today's video. The first is I want to talk a little bit about the historical context that I think is pretty important so that we get a good solid sense of, number one, who Thomas Hobbes was, when he was writing, and who his audience is. And part of our ability to fully understand his ideas without making mistaken inferences or common misconceptions about Hobbes is to understand the day in which he's writing. So the second thing I want to do then is talk about some of the key ideas that sort of laced within the Leviathan and overtly and explicitly described by Hobbes. And then secondly, I would sort of go through Thomas Hobbes' discussion here of um, of man in his discussion of the psychology of human beings, and then finally his discussion of the Commonwealth and how the Commonwealth should be structured. So that's what we're going to be taking a look at today. So let's start off with the historical context. Just a sort of brief note about his biography. Thomas Hobbes lived from 1588 to 1679. He's one of the foremost political philosophers of all time, and we might even say he's the first major political philosopher in the modern world here. One thing is this note, you can see he studied at Oxford University. I guess I can point some things out to you. He studied at Oxford University, but which is one of the first universities in the West at all, that began centuries earlier. But he also studied Italian in Italy in 1614. I thought this was important to bring up because we came in our video last week, we looked at Machiavelli and the fact that Machiavelli is writing and sort of offers this first sort of insight into what today we refer to as realpolitik, that is, how to conduct actual politics in a realistic fashion rather than simply doing the sort of ideal sense of politics that we see sort of advocated by Aristotle. But Machiavelli's ideas, though very interesting, do not constitute a sufficient analysis of the state as a whole. And he's writing in the early Renaissance here, but we see Thomas Hobbes really comes out with a much thorough and I think worked out analysis of politics in general, right? I mean, he's not simply giving advice to the prince or to the monarch the way Machiavelli does. Hobbes here is actually interested in articulating the foundation upon which any monarch or any legislatures, or really the term I should use here is sovereign, he wants to articulate the justification upon which any sovereign governs. But I want to sort of tie in Hobbes here to the Renaissance because I think it's pretty important. The other thing that's worth mentioning here is that from a very early age, Hobbes here was interested in demonstrative reasoning. And demonstrative reasoning is this idea that one begins with a premise that one accepts and then slowly moves systematically and demonstrates what is logically required or logically follows from earlier assumptions or principles. Even though Thomas Hobbes is principally known today for his political philosophy, I mean, that's pretty much all people study of him unless you become an expert in graduate school or something. But he, in his own life, was interested in lots of different things. He's interested in all the different sciences. In terms of his general work, the principal work, although he developed the elements of his politics in the 1630s, it wasn't until the publication of the Leviathan in 1660 that we see the full and I think sophisticated version of his political views. The Leviathan was published in London, but he was actually in Paris at the time. There's a sort of, one of the things there that's interesting, I'll mention in a minute, is the revolution. The English Revolution had caused a lot of changes, and during the sort of kind of topsy-turvy events of England here in the 16th century, in the 1600s, Hobbes actually goes to France. And while he's in Paris, he publishes the Leviathan. But interestingly enough, he actually presented the Leviathan, which, even though it's a formidable document for understanding and forming the basis for our own social contract theory, and the Leviathan is open to also legitimate forms of monarchy. And he presented the work to the king of France and was immediately forced to flee the country. And we'll talk a little bit about why that was in a minute here. One of the things that's sort of interesting philosophically is that Hobbes here rejects Cartesian dualism. That's the distinction between the mind and the body. His ultimate view of reality is that reality is matter. He's a materialist. And that's important because that means that he is not going to be deriving the legitimation of the state or the Commonwealth, or determine how politics should run by looking at things that have to do with God or the spirit or anything like that, right? So as a materialist, the answers for determining the justification of politics reside in the material constitution of the world. And we'll get a better sense of in a minute here, right now, when we take a look at his overall project. The other thing I should mention here is in terms of Hobbes's methodology. For him, each science, and he means science in this more, we have to be a little bit careful here. When Hobbes talks about a science, he means it in really the more ancient classical sense of the term, which has to do with demonstrative reasoning. He's not referring to science in the same sense that we think of it today in terms of an empirical investigation governed, right, by a sort of a methodology like Bacon talks about or something like that. This isn't the conception of science that Hobbes has, right? For Hobbes, each science, and there are multiple, begins with universal definitions that are established in first philosophy, and then a series of purely rational consequences are derived therefrom, okay? Now, to give you an example here, right? That means that he thinks that the first science is first philosophy, or what we would call as metaphysics. And he thinks that, of course, he's a materialist, so he has an answer there. He thinks that from there, right, this is the first science. From there, we can derive knowledge of mathematics, and then eventually the mechanical or productive sciences. That's how to build things and this sort of thing. Then he thinks we talk about physical science. Finally is moral science, and then the last of all here is civil science. And you can see that Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan essentially functions in terms of an articulation of moral and civil science. Really, civil science is the correct term, but we'll see that for Thomas Hobbes, the edicts of morality are always determined by the commonwealth in which one lives. So civil science and moral science are fundamentally related. Another thing worth mentioning here is that Thomas Hobbes was highly skeptical of religion. And he was obviously particularly apt to write to avoid the dangers of certain moral doctrines, right? Thomas Hobbes believed that many of the moral doctrines that we preach in our society, at least they were in his society, came, and he was, I think, correct in this, came from the theological vision and viewpoints held by the church of his day. Now, as an Englishman, we're talking here about the English or the Anglican church, less so about the Catholic Church. In fact, we'll see at the very end, Hobbes is particularly interested in attacking Catholic doctrine in particular. So, and Hobbes sees, for instance, let me go back here. Hobbes sees, for instance, a great evil, many great evils are the result of the sort of false moral views. And in his own day, we're not hard pressed here to find examples of what we might consider today to be great atrocities committed in the name of moral, traditional, or religious doctrine. So Hobbes is a sort of pure secularist, I think, sort of the first major secularist. Now, what is the structure of the book, of the Leviathan? The Leviathan comes in 4 parts. The first part is where he talks about man, and when he says man, he means humans, of course. But that's really the first part's on human psychology. The second part is on what a political state consists in. He calls the political state for him a commonwealth. And we'll see why in a moment here. The third and fourth part are less important for our sake. This is where he talks about Christian commonwealth, how does religion engage, how does a commonwealth change when it's a Christian commonwealth, and what's the limits of the laws that a Christian commonwealth can create. And then finally, the last part is on the kingdom of darkness. And this is in particular an attack on Catholicism. Today, the real parts that really matter to us, there's less so the third and fourth parts, but really just these first two parts. But what's the whole fundamental problem that Hobbes is interested in addressing? I think it can be summed up by one question. That question is, how can any political system unambiguously determine what is the law or what should be the law? And that's really the sort of fundamental problem that Hobbes is after in terms of addressing. Now, to give you a sense of why Hobbes thinks we need to answer this question, we should say something a little bit about the politics of the 15th century. When Hobbes is alive, monarchies rule Europe, right? And these monarchies are absolutist in nature. Now, absolutism was this sort of notion that was very popular in the 15th century with monarchs. And the idea there was that the power of the monarch was derived from God, number one. And number two, that power was absolute because God is absolute. So that meant the monarch could do anything they wanted because they had full absolute power, and that power was derived from God. Now, I'm putting here from 1642 to 1648, the English Civil War occurs. And during that time period, Oliver Cromwell, and if you're not familiar with the English Civil War, you should take some time and do some research on your own, because I don't want to trace through all of that. It's a sort of long history. But in the English Civil War, what essentially occurs is a commonwealth is set up. The monarchy was abolished for these really 6 years. But in the beginning, Oliver Cromwell was the person who spearheads and eventually takes over as, I guess, the sovereign in the case of the Commonwealth. But Oliver Cromwell, by the time he dies, England has turned from a sort of kind of civil society into almost a tyrannical sort of rule. And after Cromwell's death, the English immediately revert back to the monarchy and restore. In fact, the English refer to it as the Great Restoration. So, but this is the time in which Thomas Hobbes is writing, and this is a time in which everything that tradition is sort of thrown to the wind, and suddenly these questions emerge of what exactly should the law be? What is the law? Who has the power to make the law? And why? And we'll see that Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan really challenges this absolutism. And number one, he was going to reject the idea that the state right, the power of the sovereign comes from God. No, the power of the sovereign for Hobbes comes from the people within it. And the second thing is that the monarch is not under Thomas Hobbes's view an absolute, doesn't have absolute power. That is, the monarch, because the power of the monarch is derived or from the people, there's a limit to that power. That limit is constituted by the rights of the citizens for which the state was created. So and that may be a little bit hard to understand at this point. By the end of the video, I think you'll know what I mean, but I just want you to see that Thomas Hobbes, why was Thomas Hobbes kicked out of England and then eventually kicked out of France? Why? Because he's challenging the very basis upon which monarchy, upon which the sort of governance that exists in his day is based upon or legitimated. So he's really something of a radical figure here. And even though from our perspective, we often see Thomas Hobbes as defending monarchy, which doesn't sound too radical by our likes. In fact, he's also suspicious of democracy, I think. So we can talk a little bit about that. So let's move here to now some of the key ideas. You'll see also, for those of you who watch my other videos, I'm trying to do my videos this week on using Prezi, because I think that'll help me keep things going on track here a little bit faster and also make it a little clearer for you. Now, first thing I want to mention here is that Hobbes is going to reject Aristotle's view of nature. And remember, briefly, we talked about Aristotle has a conception of human nature in which he thinks human beings naturally are trying to attain happiness, but that conception of happiness, or eudaimonia as he calls it in Greek, right, is an objective sense, and we're all after it. Now, Hobbes he thinks that the politics exists to create that. Now, Hobbes rejects this view of Aristotle. Part of the reason is because he's a materialist. The other reason is because he's also known as an egoist, meaning he thinks that the best type of existence is one in which people naturally aim to attain their own self-interest. Now, Human beings, for Aristotle, are not naturally social, whereas for Hobbes, they're not naturally social. So the sociability that's built into our form of existence, on Hobbes's view, is artificial, right? That means that we become accustomed to societies, but we're fundamentally individualistic in our in we're fundamentally individualistic as human beings. So there's an individualism here versus a communitarianism, we might say, exists more so in Aristotle. The other idea here is that for Hobbes, there's no single conception of happiness. That's because each person determines happiness for themselves. Happiness is a sort of emotivism. And the idea here, emotivism, is the idea that we naturally, well, I don't want to go into there's a big discussion here about what emotivism is, but all I mean when I say that is that happiness is something that we naturally desire and aim towards, but it's individualistically determined. So we all want happiness, but happiness means different things for different people. The other thing Hobbes says is that most people should not participate in politics, and the state of nature is actually a state of radical equality. And we'll talk more about the state of nature here in a minute. But the first thing here is to see that Hobbes sort of stands as a solid stands in solid distinction from Aristotle or the classical politics, right? And as a materialist, he thinks that people are naturally individualistic and egoistic. Now, what are some common misconceptions? We'll say them from the beginning because you may not understand how these are misconceptions until we really get into understanding who Thomas Hobbes was. But some things that are worth mentioning. When we talk about the state of nature with regards to Hobbes, the idea is that the state of nature is not a historical event. It didn't occur at some point in time, right? Thomas Hobbes here is not a historian or an anthropologist, right? He's basically saying the state of nature exists in any situation where there's no social order. And we'll talk more about that here in a minute. The other thing is that Hobbes is not a moral relativist, even though he's an egoist, right? He thinks that each person individually determines what they think is best, but that doesn't mean that everyone's views are equal, right? Thomas Hobbes thinks that he's going to talk about what he calls laws of nature, and he thinks there are very specific rules that come out of any person's natural pursuit towards happiness or their own self-interest. And he's as a result, he's not an immoralist either, right? He's not arguing that anything goes. That's sometimes a common misconception of him. Self-preservation is a dictative reason for Hobbes. It's in fact one of the primary goals of reason, right? So human action is guided towards happiness. Self-preservation is sort of one of these primary goals, because if you don't survive, you can't be happy, right? So, and it's based upon this preservation of self-preservation here that he's actually going to articulate these, what he calls laws of nature, that govern naturally how what moral life should look like. Okay, the other thing is that for Hobbes, not everyone is wholly self-interested, right? So not everyone is an egoist, right? Some people are, they always want to do what's better for others. Some people are purely altruistic, but for Hobbes, there's not enough of these people to base a society on that, right? Most people are self-interested, and that is a sufficient condition to actually begin to found society. He thinks that benevolence if you're trying to imagine what the best sort of society looks like, and you started with the principle that everyone just wants to be altruistic, he thinks you'll end up with a foolish system, right? And the other thing here is that oftentimes we refer to Thomas Hobbes in terms of social contract here, but strictly speaking, he doesn't flesh out a social contract, right? Because he doesn't think there's a contract that's the basis for it. Rather, it's not just a contract, he calls it a covenant, right? Right, but the government is a free gift to the governed by the citizens. And that'll make a little bit more sense. But in sort of kind of the way we might quickly and sort of talk about Thomas Hobbes, I think we can lump him in with other social contract theorists, but we should be careful. We should be a bit careful here in talking about this, because he's not a contractualist like John Locke or someone. Finally, all states, he thinks, need an absolute sovereign, but that need not be a monarch, right? So even though Thomas Hobbes certainly talks a lot about monarchy, and I think for the most part he thinks monarchy is the best form of government, and he talks about the idea there has to be an absolute sovereign. For him, a sovereign is merely that body which has the absolute right to dispense the law, right? And that can be an assembly of some sort. So even though he's principally sort of thinking of monarchy, and that's the type of government that principally exists when he's alive, his philosophy is explicitly open to the possibility of of um, other types of governance. Now, what exactly is the Leviathan? Now, in the introduction here to Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, this is where this comes from. Thomas Hobbes has this beautiful analogy, and he says that the Leviathan is like an artificial animal, an artificial life, right? In the same sense that we talk about a man or a human being, we can talk about the state, right? Humans have souls. That's what the sovereign is. The joints of the body are the magistrates and officers, right? The nerve endings are the rewards and punishments with which the state dishes out, I suppose. The strength of the state is the wealth and the riches. The business of the state is the public safety, salus populi. Now, it's interesting here. It's worth mentioning because a lot of people talk about the idea that the fundamental goal of the state of a government is to protect its citizens. Thomas Hobbes agrees completely, right? That idea comes from Thomas Hobbes. We'll see that other political philosophers think that there's more to it than just that. Now, he thinks that the counselors or advisors or something like the memory. For us, we might say the bureaucracy of the government, for instance. The health of the state can be found in the public concord. And when we talk about public concord, we're talking about the way in which the public is bound to itself, right? Whereas sedition, the breaking apart of public bonds, is something like a sickness. And finally, civil war would be the death of the state, right? Now, what are the categories of investigation for Hobbes? He thinks that we can talk about form and function, or matter and function, right? The matter of the state is man, human beings, because human beings are what make up the society, right? So we'd have to understand what human beings are, and then finally, we'd have to look at how does the state function? What are the forms of state? And that would include things like the covenants, the laws, what is the power, who has the authority, and what preserves or dissolves the state. And we'll see that really this first section here, matter, is what he talks about in part 1 of Leviathan. Part 2 is really what he talks about, the functions of the state. Okay? Now, we should talk a little bit about this. Now, where exactly does the need for politics emerge? And we'll get into this a little bit more in a minute here when we get to the laws, to the idea of the state of nature. But there's 3 fundamental facts of existence that fundamentally form the basis for why politics or governments exist. The first is the 3 facts of existence. The first is the equality of power. Thomas Hobbes thinks that human beings in nature, and when we say nature, that means any situation where there is no governance or no state or nation or anything like this, or no sovereign, right? In a natural situation, human beings are essentially equal in terms of power, right? We have very, very similar bodies and very, very similar powers of mind. Now, of course, each particular individual varies in terms of their power and this sort of thing, and their abilities. But fundamentally, we're equal in terms of our general abilities. We're also generally equal in terms of our need, right? We all need shelter. We all need food. We all need other resources for happiness, right? But guess what? There's also the fact that there's scarcity. The fact of scarcity means there's not enough. So we all have a certain equality of power and a certain equality of need, but there's not enough for everyone. There's not enough to go around for everyone. And so because of that, that means that strife occurs. Now, there's 3 reasons for strife according to Hobbes. Those include competition among each other for resources, diffidence. Diffidence is distrust, right? So if I have an equality of need and there's a scarce resource, right? I need water. You need water. There's not enough for both of us to go around. Number 1 is we're going to compete with each other. Now, but that also means that we also distrust each other. And that's what diffidence is. Another possible reason for strife is glory, right? That's the idea that I ultimately want to improve my reputation, my lot, and ultimately my power through strife. And so he says these are the three reasons that leads to this. Now, politics is a way of answering both these problems in strife as well as these problems in existence. Now, what are some other fundamental concepts we got to mention here? And these will become really quite important. The first is his discussion of law and liberty. What is he talking about? The first here is jus naturale, and that's the right of nature, right? That's the right of nature. And the right of nature here is the most fundamental natural rights that we have. Or the right of, I shouldn't say natural right, law of nature, I would be careful here. But that's the natural rights, the right of nature. The second is liberty, and he's going to define liberty as the absence of an external impediment. So the freedom or liberty, which I'm going to use those terms synonymously here, but liberty refers to the inability to be stopped, right? That's what liberty is, right? So liberty isn't conceived of in a positive sense. It's rather understood and defined negatively. It's defined as the absence of external impediments. Now, lex naturalis, this is the law of nature. These are general rules by reason that we can derive through reason, which citizens are forbidden to do. I'm reading it too quickly here, right? These are natural laws that we can derive through reason in terms of human conduct. And they're fundamentally come from this idea that citizens should be forbidden to do that which is destructive, right? And so there's these three different categories for talking about rights, laws, and liberty, okay? Now, there's two basic laws of nature, and we'll see. Actually, I'm going to give lots more laws of nature, but the first two are really critical. The first is to seek peace and preserve it, and the second is by all means we have a capacity to defend ourselves. If we take these two principles these two laws of nature as axiomatic, we're going to end up with, Hobbes says, is a whole litany of laws of nature that are really unwritten laws, but are also what help us make sense of the laws that do exist, the explicit legal laws. Okay, and we'll get into that more. Now, what does that also mean consequently? It means that man can relinquish his natural rights towards some sort of reciprocal goal. Now, Hobbes's view here, and this will make more sense again when we get to the state of nature, but the idea here is that in nature, in pre-political life, before I exist in a political society, I have the right to do anything I want. My rights are essentially equal with yours. But because of these natural rights, I want peace and I want to preserve it and I want to defend myself through the state. What essentially means is that we give up some of our natural rights. In turn, we have civil rights, okay? Now, but this is not a contract. A contract requires what Hobbes calls a delivery transfer, right? A contract is when I give you something and you give something back to me in return. But you can see the language of a contract here doesn't really make sense because it's not an exchange in society. It's more like a pact, right? So what we're talking about here in terms of social governance is we relinquish our natural rights for civil rights, and we do this in a form of a pact between parties. And the fundamental idea here is that we keep a promise, that we keep our promises in good faith. We keep our promise to allow the society to give us civil laws that provide peace and safety so I don't have to defend myself. But in so doing, I forfeit my natural rights, okay? Now, let me say this a little bit here. What's the idea? Part of the reason that what might help make sense here, I guess, is this idea that for Hobbes, what is wrong or what is right, right? The distinction between wrong and right doesn't exist in nature. It only exists in civil society. That is, moral life is constituted through the conventions we hold together in civil life. Okay, so let me jump here now and really get into some of the basics and some of the specific mechanics of Hobbes's discussion of man. Okay, the first here, let's talk about, and by the way, these roughly correspond to the chapters. I can't cover everything in this video that comes in these chapters. that we're reading, but I will cover the things that I think that are most critical. So the first thing he talks about is what is the power, the worth, the dignity, the honor, whatever. What makes a human being worthy, right? And so the first thing he talks about here is man's natural power is instrumental. What that means is that human beings have certain capacities, certain abilities to do things, right? They can be as simple as walking from here to there, or another natural power is the reason. But all of these powers are instrumental. That is, their value consists in the ability to make other things occur, right? Reason is an instrument towards an end, right? My ability to walk or use my body for labor, for instance, these are all instrumental powers. I use these powers to get something else, right? Now, the greatest power of all is the communal power that's created by consent. That is, when I work with another person and we combine our powers together, that power will always be greater than the power of a single individual, right? So the examples Hobbes gives here is, for instance, if you have servants, you have greater power. If you have friends, you have greater power. And obviously that means institutions have greater power, because institutions, say for instance, universities or things of that sort, churches, right? They also operate through consent and they have communal power. And that communal power is greater than an individual's natural power. But the power there is still instrumental. Okay. Now, what are some of the types of powers? There's lots of things we could talk about, but here are some of the specific ones that Hobbes talks about. One, he says, riches and liberality. Liberality means generosity. They breed power, right? If you have wealth and you give generously, that makes people want to consent to do what you're doing, which means that that's a type of power. The reputation of power is power. It's interesting, right? One of the things that's been spoken of recently, one of the criticisms against Barack Obama, the president, has been that because of the way he has handled the Syrian crisis, there's been a loss of reputation for the United States. And that loss of reputation actually indicates a loss of power itself, right? And that's what Hobbes, I think, would argue too. I don't know about Obama, but he would argue that that logic makes sense, right? That the reputation of power is itself a type of power. Another idea here is that good success, right? The greatest power is continually, not that I shouldn't say the greatest power, but good success is its own power, right? Reputation of being prudential or practical is important. Nobility, eloquence, form is power. The sciences are small powers. That is, having knowledge is also a small power. And then finally, the public use of art is another type of power. Now, there are more powers we could talk about here, but these are some of the critical powers that he talks about specifically in this chapter, this first chapter in the Leviathan. Now, what is the value of man? What's the worth of man? The worth of man is signified by the value, and the value of a man is his price for the use of his power, right? Which means that my value consists in, for instance, the price I'm willing to accept for the use of my powers, whatever those powers be. I teach philosophy, which means those powers are intellectual powers, I suppose, right? Um, so that's what my value is. It's essentially monetary, right? Now, dignity refers to the public worth of a man. And honor is how much power one has. It's the sign of power. And there's this other concept I think is pretty important. That's the notion of fitness. And fitness is the idea. Fitness refers to the ability for a person to discharge their duty. So the fitness of a student concerns their ability to fulfill the duties of a student, turning in assignments, this sort of thing. The fitness of an instructor or a professor consists in their ability to discharge their professorial duties. Now that's important because it also means that we can gauge a sovereign or a politician based upon their fitness. Their fitness can be determined by their ability to discharge their duties. And so we can judge and determine different players and what their worthiness is in the context of civil life. Okay. Now, he then moves to this section he calls the difference of manners, right? What is manners? Manners refers to the decency of behavior. Now, when we talk about behavior, we're not just talking about, cutting, using the right fork in a fancy restaurant, right? What we're talking that, of course, is is somehow related, though, right? But what we're really talking about in terms of Hobbes here is the idea that we're the manners concern how we live together with others in peace and unity, right? And we need to have manners. That is, we need to learn ways of living together in peace and unity. That's what society is trying to develop, and that's certainly what our moral life is about. Now, there's a human psychological propensity for power. That is that human beings naturally have a general inclination for what Hobbes calls, quote, a perpetual and restless desire of power after power. Human beings naturally want power. They want to be in charge, right? And so the question is, how does one balance both the need for manners and this human desire for power to be in charge? Now, as we mentioned before, competition for powers leads to three things, Hobbes tells us: contention, conflict, enmity, and finally war, right? And other factors which lead to strife is fear and distrust, vainglory, ambition. Ignorance is a very important one, right? Ignorance of both natural causes, that means I don't understand what's happening or why it's happened, and also ignorance of understanding, that is, ignorance of, that means when a politician or a person lacks the very capacity for understanding, that also leads to strife. And finally, another way in which strife or war can emerge is through the adherence to custom for custom's sake, right? I'm just doing it because it's traditional, right? Or another person has injured my custom, and so to adhere to my custom, I may lead to strife, right? And so what he wants to sort of begin to lay out here are the sort of areas in which human beings psychologically that guide human actions. Because if we're going to talk about the foundation or the foundation for why a political order can be legitimated, and we're not going to rely on God, well, we first have to talk about human beings and what it means to be a human being, right? Okay. Now, what is the natural condition? And this is very, very important: the state of nature. Now, the state of nature, as we mentioned before, is not a historical time period. It refers to any situation in which there is no governance whatsoever. Now, the state of nature is one in which every person is equal by nature, right? And in a state of nature, you can imagine this is sort of perfectly encapsulated by um, um, the book, The Lord of, I'm sorry, the book The Lord of the Flies, right? Where these children end up on this island, there's no law, that's a state of nature. Everyone's fundamentally equal. That is, everyone is free to do whatever they want because there's no governance at all, right? Now, the idea here is that out of equality, out of this natural equality proceeds dividends, right? We stop trusting each other when we're all equal, because it's sort of counterintuitive here, because we usually think of trust as something that binds us together in equality. But his idea is no. When we're all naturally equal, we don't trust each other, because that means that I have the freedom to kill you to take your property, but you also have the freedom to kill me to take my property. You can see here that means we're all in conflict, so then we don't trust each other. And from this distrust we get war. And so and he actually calls this a war of all against all. Everyone's against each other. Now, in a war such as this, nothing is unjust. Now, that seems like a crazy, ludicrous statement. What does he mean by this? What he means is that in a war of all against all, since everyone is their own judge or arbiter for what they can do, right? There is no government. Everything is permitted. But if everything's permitted, there's nothing that's just or unjust, really. Everything is allowed. So injustice can only make sense in a political form of life. Sort of interesting question you might think about, right? In a world where or in a society that, or it wouldn't be a society, but in a state of nature, a war of all against all, there's nothing immoral, right? Everything is permitted. Think about that. What do you think about that? Now, obviously, in a war of all against all, it's a nightmare, right? And in fact, Hobbes says that life under this condition or these conditions would be short, brutish, and cruel. It's not a life worth living for the most part. Now, why do we get peace then if we have a war of all against all? Well, his argument is that peace results from the inclinations by the passions. Now, we have certain inclinations. One of them is the fear of death. We don't want to die. We want to live commodious living, right? We don't want to be constantly under threat of siege, for instance. And we also naturally all hope to attain a better condition for ourselves, right? We all want to have a better, attain something better for ourselves now, or attain something, whatever's in our interest. Now, you put those passions together, and there's naturally this inclination to have peace and not have war, which means that we're ultimately going to come upon the founding of the state. Now, before we get into how Hobbes begins to identify the legitimation of the state, he does articulate what he calls these natural laws. And I already mentioned the first two here, which is the first fundamental law of nature here is to seek peace. And the second is to contract in a way of peace, right? To bind ourselves in some sort of peaceful accord, right? And so what Hobbes wants to do here is lay out these fundamental laws of nature. Or I'm sorry, I shouldn't say laws of nature, say natural laws, right? Now, liberty in a political commonwealth, we have to mention, though, is the divestment of natural freedom. I'm going to, throughout this course, going to refer to this as the process of alienation. The idea here is that in the state of nature, we're free to do anything we want, but in order for peace's sake, we give up on that natural freedom. We divest ourselves of it, or we alienate it from ourselves in order to have a more peaceful contract in which we can live that meets these inclinations for peace we have. Now, what's the process by which this occurs? The process is, number one, we renounce the renunciation of these natural freedoms. And then there's the transference of our liberty, our natural liberty, to a sovereign. And then finally, obligations set up by those sovereigns are given to us. So we have obligations to fulfill. So the natural rights, we first give those up, we give them to someone else. And once we've given those up, we now have obligations. But those obligations rest upon this idea that we're going to live in peace, right? Now, here's the other thing that Hobbes mentions is that not all rights are alienable. That means that some rights cannot be taken away from you, right? Even if you freely give them up, philosophically, you can't, right? That means, for instance, self-protection. I have the right to protect myself from bodily injury no matter what. Even if, Hobbes says, even if someone from the government is coming to harm me and they have good cause to do so, right? Naturally, I will always default to this self-protection, and that's a natural law. So you can't take away the right of people to protect themselves. And you can't also force people to accuse themselves. So we have freedom from self-accusation, he says. That is, I can never be forced, or let's say this, you can't alienate my right not to injure myself and to accuse myself of committing wrong or something like this. This is something the government can't make me do. This is the philosophical basis for the idea of people, people who are, usually we think of them as guilty, but we have the right not to incriminate ourselves. That comes philosophically directly from Hobbes's argument here regarding self-accusation. Now, let me run through the other laws of nature that he talks about, because it's fairly inquisitive. Because remember, we talked about that he's interested in demonstrative reason. He thinks that we can sort of whittle away logically and determine what some natural laws for human action are based on this flight, if you will, from the state of nature. Now, what's this third law of nature? Is that men should perform and fulfill their covenants. So this is the idea that you have to keep your promises, right? And it's in this discussion of keeping promises that we get the sense of what justice is, right? Because remember, for Hobbes, in the state of nature, everything's allowed. So as soon as the state of nature ends, that means that we now have an obligation to keep our promises. And the first fundamental promise is that we give up some of our freedom to the society. Now, that means that justice, that if you break your promise, that's what constitutes injustice or injustice. And whatever is not unjust is just. So justice is always defined negatively as that which is not, you're not contractually obligated not to do, I guess. Right? So that means justice and propriety, that is the ability to have ownership and this sort of thing, begin with the Constitution of the Commonwealth. But justice is not contrary to reason or subjectively determined, right? So that means that reason is not going to go against justice in his view, and simultaneously justice isn't just made up by individuals. Justice is the result of demonstrative reasoning. Now, for Hobbes, the reason that's so critical is because otherwise you could end up with some sort of form of relativism or immoralism that we want to avoid. Now, there's two fundamental types of justice, and really take pains to recognize these. There's commutative justice, Hobbes says, and there's distributive justice. And here's the way I want you to see this. Commutative justice refers to equal treatment, right? We all are equal under the law. So justice has to be fair to everyone. It's equal treatment. But on the other hand, another type of justice is thinking about how goods, resources, services are distributed. And here's the idea is that distributive justice needs to have equal benefit for all, right? Equal benefit for all. So this distinction between types of justice is important. Now, in terms of injustice, nothing done to a man by his own consent can be considered an injury, right? And that's an important thing. So we have to say this, is that if we consent to something, then we can't say that that consent results in injury, right? Because otherwise you end up basically creating a contradiction. You make justice irrational, right? That means that, for instance, taxes are not an injury, right? Some people think that the state is harming them by taxing them. But here's the thing, Hobbes would say, is that you've consented to live under the laws of this form of government. And that includes taxation, which means that taxation is not, properly speaking, an injury to your person. Just because there's taxation laws doesn't mean that, and you don't like them, isn't sufficient to argue that you've been injured by the state, not politically speaking. Okay, let's run through there's a lot of these laws, and what I want to do is just sort of go through them here. The fourth law is the gratitude for those who voluntarily give grace to another, right? This idea here is that when other people help us, right, altruistically, voluntarily, that we should respond in gratitude, right? Is that we shouldn't respond in harm to them, right? The fifth law of nature is complaisance, and that's the idea that every man strives to accommodate himself to the rest, right? That is, that we try to work with others, if you will, right? The sixth law, upon caution of a future time, a man ought to pardon offenses past of them that repenting desire it. So, given that certain conditions, when possible, we should look to pardon other people's offenses, to forgive, and this sort of thing, right? The next one here is, in the case of revenge, men ought to look not at the greatness of an evil that was committed, but to the greatness of the good that will follow, right? And you can see how this natural law would be important for thinking about how people should be punished and that sort of thing. People should be punished. Punishment should be based upon the good that that punishment will create, not upon the retribution for the evil that was committed. So there's a distinction here between retributive justice and consequential justice. The idea here is we're not trying to get back at criminals. We're trying to create a better society, and it's on that basis that we create the sorts of punishments that we do. Now, I'll just run through these. The eighth natural law of nature is that men should not declare hatred or contempt of one another, right? That people shouldn't openly and publicly attack each other, right? Ninth is that every man acknowledge another for his equal by nature, right? And this, he calls this avoiding pride, right? Is that no one's fundamentally naturally better than another, right? So the nature, freedom and equality is a fact of nature, right? And it's interesting because here really equality is disrupted by the state, not, right, in order to promote peace and this sort of thing. Natural equality is. The 10th law of nature is that no one should reserve a right for himself that no one else enjoys, right? So you can't just, right, the fundamentally right should be dispersed throughout all the society. Now, if a man be trusted to, there's a mistake, but if a man be trusted to judge between man and man, that he deal equally between them, right? So the judges have to be equal, and that common things, 12, common things should be enjoyed equally or proportioned fairly. Number 13, where common possession or proportion is not possible or available, this should be determined by lottery, right? Here you can think of, right, you can say common things should be enjoyed equally or proportionally fairly, right? But that's not always the case, right? Sometimes we can't all enjoy or proportion things equally. So how do we figure that out? We do it by lottery. And think here about the way we choose juries, right? Fundamentally, each juror is equal to another juror, right? But not everyone in a community can be a juror for one trial, right? So we create a system of lottery to figure that out, right? We can't proportion it out equally among the population, but through lottery, we can proportion it fairly. Hopefully that makes sense. 14, where things cannot be determined otherwise, the right should go to the first possessor. This is what I call, this is my quotations here. This is something like the foundation for private property. The idea here is that if it's not determined, if it can't be determined by proportion or equality or lottery, then it goes to the person who has it first, right? This is the first come, first serve sort of law of nature, to put it vulgarly. 15, all men that mediate peace be allowed safe conduct. That is, people who live peacefully should be allowed to live peacefully, right? This is why I think, for instance, about all of these horrible shootings that occur on schools. That violates the 15th law of nature on Hobbes's view, right? Because you have people who are mediating peace, but then they don't have safe conduct. Right. So, and you can see this is really critical. Number 16, where controversy arrives, an arbiter or an arbitrator of some sort should decide. Number 17, no man should be his own judge. Right. Everyone should be judged by another person. And number 18, one should not judge where one is partial. Right. So you shouldn't be the judge if you can't be fair. Right, and then 19, a judge must give equal weight to each witness. So a judge can't be partial to one witness versus another. He has to hear them all out. Now, what is all of these? He actually gives 19 laws of nature. Where do all of these laws? They all get summarized here in really what we normally refer to as the golden rule, right? Or as he puts it, quote, do not that to another which thou wouldst not have done to thyself, right? That is, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And he thinks that principle here, this golden rule, essentially encapsulates all of these laws of nature, right? Now, that's a sort of basis for how he begins to understand human beings. And humans are the matter, we're the stuff that a society or a state or a political system is made up of. The question, though, is how should that be formed? What's the function or the form of the Commonwealth, right? And in this first section, he goes and he talks about here the cause, the generation, and the definition of the Commonwealth. Now, the cause, what is the cause here of the Commonwealth? Well, the final end, really the goal for the Commonwealth is the security of its citizens. So it's that fundamental goal that functions as the cause of the society. And when we take these natural laws, we combine them with these natural passions, and the need for security, that's the reason for why we have states. It's fairly simple, right? We need some sort of social organization in which we can get our own personal safety can be guaranteed, right? And that follows out of this natural reasoning process. You can see here he's not a relativist at all, right? He's sort of a materialist, sort of natural law materialist, I guess. Now, the generation, what actually creates the state? Right? That cause is why the state exists. The generation is how it comes into existence. And he says, number one is that the state doesn't come, and I'm going to use the term state or in Commonwealth synonymously, but the state doesn't just come from a few men or families, nor does it come from just a mass of people, right? Because the state has to be continual in nature, right? It's not something that just emerges and then just disappears, emerges and disappears. There's a continuity over time, through time, that the state has, right? Because families are not continuous, they disappear, right? And masses are not continuous, they also disappear, right? Now, the other thing is the generation of the state fundamentally exists with the alienation of freedom. When people, quote, authorize and give up their rights of governing themselves, and they give them up to another person or assembly or individuals. But they do so on the condition that they give up. Oops, it looks like there's a number of spelling errors here. My apologies, right? But it would be this idea. Let me actually pull out the book here. See if I can find it in time here. Let's see here. One sec here. When, quote, okay, let's go back here. But the state is fundamentally generated when people, a whole society, essentially give the consent to some sort of government or sovereign, right? When they, quote, I authorize and give up my right of governing myself to this man or to this assembly of men, and on this condition, that thou give up thy right to him and authorize all his actions in like manner, right? So it's generated when I say I give up my freedom to this government, but on the condition that everyone else does so too. When everyone does so, that's when the state comes into existence, right? Um, and the definition here means that the essence of a commonwealth is contained in the sovereign. Now, the sovereign is that person or assembly that we give up our natural freedom towards, right? And we give up our natural freedom and in place get civil freedom. That is freedom that we're allowed in our society. Now, let's talk about the sovereign because the sovereign is really important. And I put of the rights of sovereigns because we could talk about multiple sovereigns, or this could even refer to an assembly, right? And just go through a couple things here. The first here is that the subject can, once the sovereign has been created, the Commonwealth has been created through this sort of divesting of natural freedom. Number one, the subjects can't change the form of government, right? So just because one doesn't like the sovereign doesn't mean you can just change the government, right? That is not a legitimate, that's not legitimate, right? The sovereign's power cannot be forfeit, right? That is, the sovereign can't give up their power because they are the ones who hold the power. And in fact, we'll see that Thomas Hobbes says that if the sovereign gives up their power, they actually destroy the Commonwealth, and a new Commonwealth would have to be constituted, right? There's no protest if majority vote is allowed. Now, I was a little bit quick here, right? But the idea here is that if the majority of people give up, right, their natural freedom and create this, that simply because I don't like what the majority has said, that doesn't do anything. You're not allowed to do that. You can't change the sovereign's behavior because you don't agree with it and you're in the minority. And we'll see this isn't fully worked out because especially later on, contemporary political philosophers are concerned with this idea of majority vote, right? How do we protect this notion of minority rights? This never comes up in Hobbes and Locke for that matter. It could, though it does with Rousseau. Anyway, let's keep going. The subjects cannot justly accuse the sovereign's actions. The subjects cannot punish the sovereign. The sovereign is judge of what is necessary for the subjects. The subjects cannot take rights that have been given by the sovereign, right? Have been the sovereign is the one who should write the laws, who should legislate. The sovereign is the one who adjudicates conflicts. The sovereign is the one who decides matters of war and peace. The sovereign is the person who chooses the advisors of the bureaucracy of the government. The sovereign is the one who should decide and what the punishments and rewards of the society are. And finally, the rights of a sovereign are indivisible, meaning they can't be divvied up and given out to different people, that they all should exist. Now, Hobbes' idea here is very much monarchical in the sense that he sees the Leviathan as having really absolute power. But the absolute power is based upon the will of the citizens to give up their natural freedom, not on God. But we'll see when we get to someone like John Locke, he wants to really say, wait a second, there needs to be a lot more limits in the power of the sovereign, and he has a much more sort of, I think, sophisticated way of looking at this. Now, what are the different types of commonwealths that are popular? It's interesting. He says there's really only three types of government. There's monarchy, where you have a single ruler. There's democracy, where you have inequality. You have where people vote and create a government, where government that's equal to all, right? You know what democracy is. And of course, there's aristocracy. There's few rule. And here's what he says. He says, listen, Aristotle and Machiavelli and Plato, they all talked about the difference between tyranny and oligarchy and monarchy. And Hobbes here, I think in very typical modern fashion, just says, no, let's just be simple about it. Tyranny is just a bad form of monarchy. Oligarchy is just a bad form of aristocracy. But they're fundamentally the same. So there is no difference here. Now, in the same chapter, he talks about, well, how should monarchs, how should succession work when a monarch dies? How can you dispossess a monarch of their power and this sort of thing? But ultimately, these are the three types of governments, three types of commonwealth, but each of them has a sovereign power, right? The sovereign power of the monarch, right, exists within the king or the monarch or the queen. The sovereign power of the democracy exists within the assembly created by the democratic mechanism. In the aristocracy, the sovereign power there resides in this sort of elite council of people, whoever they are. Okay, so there's really just three types, and I think that's a lot easier than remembering this sort of kind of um, difficult debate we see articulated by Plato and Aristotle and Machiavelli. Okay, let's move on here. There's also the distinction between the paternal and despot types of power. Now, how does a sovereign gain power? Well, there's two possibilities, either by institution or by force. Now, that is, a sovereign can be instituted through constitutional means, right? We create the society and give someone the power. In this institutional power would be a thing of the way the first president gained power, right? In the United States, George Washington, through vote, that was institutional acquisition of the sovereign. By force, as if I, obviously take over, or a foreign government invades and then reconstitutes the social contract with themselves as the sovereign. Now, acquisition by institution is essentially what he calls paternal dominion. That means that, like a parent, or we have to be a little bit careful because he also says it's not exactly the same, right? But like a parent, the sovereign in this sense is created through generation, generated through the community, instituted accordingly. And this is a sort of paternal dominion. And then despotical dominion is when, by force, a sovereign takes over. Okay. Now, sovereignty in all commonwealths, though, according to his view, should be understood as absolute. Okay, and we sort of covered that. It's full-fledged. It can't take it away, and it can't be divided. Okay, let's talk. So then, what does freedom mean, and how much freedom or liberty does a subject have in proportion to the sovereign here? What does it mean to be free or have freedom or liberty, right? And we'll use those terms synonymously. Now, what is it to be free? Here's the quote from page 108. He says, "A freeman is he that who those things which by his strength and wit he is able to do is not hindered to do what he has a will to do," right? It's freedom of action, right? Non-hindrance, freedom from interference. That's what he's talking about. Now, on the consistency of freedom, here's what he wants to say is that fear and liberty are consistent. Liberty and necessity are consistent. And the reason he has to put these down is because if liberty and fear aren't consistent, or if liberty and necessity aren't consistent, because remember, it's out of fear and necessity that the state emerges. If those things aren't consistent with freedom, then we're going to end up with a really, really problematic situation in which in which there is no freedom, or it would be possible for the government to take away all of your freedom to alleviate your fear, or to take away all of your freedom to alleviate necessity. He doesn't think that, right? He wants to argue that the correct form of society is a society that has liberty, and it's rationally consistent. Now, the other idea here is that liberty of the subject is also consistent with the unlimited power of the sovereign, right? The unlimited power of the sovereign. So, he thinks all of these things are consistent. Now, by the way, if you don't like Thomas Hobbes, then the thing to do would be to attack him on this, because if it isn't consistent, then his whole system here begins to unfurl. Okay. Now, let's go over a couple other details here. The liberty of the subjects consists in the liberty from covenants. Now, what does that mean? That means my freedom consists in in the relation I have with the covenants I make and the covenants that I don't have. That's what liberty is. Liberty is related to these covenants, or these promises that we make. Now, subjects have the natural liberty to defend their own bodies, even against even against those that are lawfully invading. And they also have liberty not to injure themselves, both physically and morally or mentally. right? So you always have this freedom, right? That the sovereign, even an unlimited sovereign, can't take that away from you. Now, the greatest liberty of the subjects depends on the silence of the law. Now, this is a very interesting passage he has here. What is he, and it's between pages 108 and 140, 114. The idea is this, is that when there is no law about something, that means that I'm free to do it. If so, the more silence there is in the law, the greater the liberty of the subjects. So how great my liberty is depends upon the silence of the law. And here's where, for instance, people who call themselves politically conservative in the United States really are adhering to this idea, right? Is that we should have less laws to promote liberty. If you're a libertarian, you certainly agree with that, right? Though we should say Thomas Hobbes is not a libertarian. Um, but but this is the sort of notion here, is the greatest liberty of subjects depends on the silence of the law. Now the next thing here is the subjects are absolved of their duty to the sovereign. The question is, when do I not have a duty to do what the sovereign commands, right? Well, number one, when they're no longer protected by the sovereign. That's fundamental, because remember, the fundamental sort of linchpin of the whole system is protection, safety. Now, if I can't be protected by the sovereign, that sovereign no longer has right over me, right? Because that means the contract, well, I have to be careful, the covenant, the pact has been dissolved. Now, that would include cases of captivity, right? It would include cases where the sovereign relinquishes their authority, or if one is banished, or if the sovereign renders himself subject to another, right? The sovereign gives up their sovereignty to another. Think about, for instance, when Austria gave up their political power to Nazi Germany, right? That's an example when, under those conditions, the subjects are absolved of their duty to the sovereign. So you can see how there's lots of interesting relations here. Now, what is the goal of the sovereign? The sovereign, part of the goal of the sovereign is not simply the execution of the law and also the judgment of the law, but is the creation of the law. Now, we're not talking about natural laws, remember, we're talking about civil laws. These are laws that are created, that are particular, that are explicitly laid out by the sovereign, whoever that sovereign is. Now, civil laws are laws that men are bound to observe because they are members of a particular commonwealth. Notice they're particular, right? So the laws of one set of civil laws are not necessarily existing in other social contracts. In fact, he gives a specific definition: a civil law is to every subject those rules which the Commonwealth has commanded to make use of for distinction of right and wrong, that is to say, of what is contrary and what is not contrary to the rule. That's from page 187. Now, who makes the laws? Well, the sovereign is the one who legislates, right? But importantly, the sovereign is not subject to the laws, right? We have to be careful here what we mean by this. What we mean is that the sovereign is not, the sovereign as a structural feature of a commonwealth is not subject to the laws, right? Because the laws are for the citizens, they're for the subjects, they're not for the sovereign themselves, right? Um, right. But we'll see that there are limits to the sovereign, right? Even though it's absolute power, there is a limit to the power, right? The law is legitimated upon the sovereign consent, not tradition, right? What am I saying there? Is that the laws are, in fact, the law when the sovereign says they are, not simply because everyone's accustomed to them, because they're traditional, because they're custom, whatever, right? The laws get their legitimation from the sovereign, not from any other means. And the sovereign gets their power from the citizens, not by any other means. Okay? Now, the law of nature and the civil law contain each other. So he doesn't think that the laws of nature we went over are ever going to go directly, or ever going to be directly opposed to these civil laws, even though the civil laws are not are unwritten laws, right? The unwritten laws are laws of nature, right? The other thing he says that's important here is that secret laws are not laws, right? That if a law is created by a sovereign but isn't actually told to the people, then the people can't obviously fulfill that law. So secret laws are not technically laws philosophically. Now that raises an interesting question for us, especially when we consider the use of secret courts in determining secret procedures for actions, right? I'm thinking of the NSA in particular and the role of the National Security Administration in terms of its working with the secret court, the FISA court, in order to determine what's legal and what's not, and the FISA court issuing certain laws, but no one knows what those laws are because they're secret laws. It raises this question about whether or not, since those laws are secret, whether or not they really should be counted as laws. Okay. Um, okay. Another problem with secret laws is how can you follow them, right? A good telltale sign of a society headed for tyranny is the creation of secret laws, right? Because then you can use those secret laws to do anything you want, and get rid of anyone you want. So it's a big issue, really, really important to think about. In this same section, Hobbes talks about how do you interpret the law, right? Because we have these laws that are created, but they have to be interpreted. And here's what he says. Number one, the interpretation of law depends upon the sovereign. Now you can see here is that in our society, the laws are written by Congress, but the executive, the president, right, is in charge of the Department of Justice, which actually has the task of interpreting the law. So we actually follow this fairly closely. The interpretation of natural law, though, is not determined by the Commonwealth. Because remember, the civil law, right, refers to the particular laws of the Commonwealth, but the interpretation of natural law is dependent upon the natural use of reason, right? So that means these natural laws, right, since the civil laws are supposed to be contained, the natural law and the civil laws contain each other, you can see that if a civil law is created that is overtly opposed to natural laws, then what's going to win out legitimately is the natural law, right? Because because this Commonwealth can't interpret the natural law. Only individual reasoning agents can do that. Okay, the juridical decisions, right? There's an interesting thing is that when a judge decides something, these decisions should not bind future decisions, right? So every decision in a court of law that's made is made for that moment. It's not made for the future. That doesn't mean that future judges don't look to the past for consistency, but it means that future laws don't necessarily bind them, not philosophically, right? I'm not talking legally, but philosophically. And finally, there's this distinction between law and right, right? Civil law is an obligation, right? When a law is passed, I'm obliged to follow it, right? But doing what is naturally right is not obligatory, right? Okay, let's keep going here. The weakening of the Commonwealth. I know we're moving fast here, we're covering a lot of information, but thanks for your patience. Now, the question here is, how do Commonwealths slowly degrade over time? And he lists a lot of problems, a lot of things that lead to the dissolution or the diseasing, to lead to the dissolution of a Commonwealth. You can almost see them as sorts of types of diseases of politics, political diseases. I think that's a helpful analogy. But ultimately, all of these problems come from imperfect institutions, lead to the dissolution of Commonwealth. Imperfect institutions lead to these problems, right? Now, problems that lead to dissolution include the want of absolute power, private judgment of good and evil, erroneous conscience, pretense of inspiration, subjecting the sovereign to civil laws, attributing absolute propriety to subjects, right? And by the way, propriety here refers to property ownership. So he thinks that no subject, no citizen has absolute property rights over the things they own, right? And when you give that absolute property right to them, you end up weakening the Commonwealth. Interesting question here, and I'm sort of interested to see what people might think, is think about recent gun laws, right? The Second Amendment, the right to bear arms that is upheld today in the United States courts, is not the same right to bear arms that was passed by the early founding fathers in the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment, 10 Amendments to the Constitution, right? And the original idea of the right to bear arms was to have militias to protect the state, to protect the Commonwealth against other usurpers, internal and external. But over time, today, for various reasons I won't go into, the right to bear arms has become increasingly absolute, meaning that no one can take it away from you, right? And I think certainly the NRA and certain libertarian advocates would argue that there is an absolute right to your own property of owning weapons and this sort of thing, right? But the thing is, the more absolute that right becomes, that means the less power the state has to control it. That over time may weaken the state. Now, that's whether or not that this issue actually applies to the Second Amendment, I'll leave to you to think about it, for you to decide. I'm not convinced either way, right? But I just want to point out that there's a structural problem, right? His idea here is that we can create sort of structural laws that can slowly gird or weaken the state over time. And it has nothing to do with what laws we're talking about, but as soon as you give increasingly absolute rights to subjects, right, you're going to create a problem. And by the way, to be fair, we don't have an absolute right to weapons in our society. But we have a more absolute right to weapons than we do anything else, right? It's interesting, for instance, in the state of Texas, we have a greater right to have weaponry than we do have a right to vote. Because the recent voting laws in Texas have actually significantly increased the requirements that would allow a person to vote. Where if you compare those legal requirements to vote, they're much harsher than they are for the requirements to have a weapons license. So think about it for a moment. In Texas, at least, if it's easier to own a gun than it is to vote, this seems to be a political issue. They should at least be equal, you'd think, right? Because certainly the right to vote is more fundamental. Or is it? Huh? You can see there may be an argument either way. Anyway, I'll leave that for you. Let me just keep going through the list here. Another way in which states can be weakened is if they try to imitate neighboring nations, right? Or the imitation of the Greeks and Romans. Mixed governance. If there's need of money, there's poverty in the state. Monopolies and abuses of publicans. He actually says like whenever there's small groups of individuals who have political power, other sorts of communitarian power within a society, if they become monopolies, they will destroy it. And he actually specifically mentions the excess of corporations here as well. Popular men, right? You can see here, this is where, for instance, this almost happened to our own state, right? After that one point, after the Articles of Confederation, right, there was almost another rebellion in the United States, right? That had to do with sort of the popularity of certain individuals. But anyway, popular men. You can think here about like Mussolini takes over, or you can think another example here would be think about Russia and think about the popular sort of the cult of personality that dictatorships try to develop. And I don't know if Russia is a dictatorship per se. I don't think it is. It's a republic, but it's a weak republic. And it's a weak republic partially because there's a sort of cult of personalities that surrounds President Putin, rather than the strength of the state being in its institution. It resides in the man. Because the question is, what happens when Putin dies, right, or gets old and is no longer able to be the president? The institution has always been so weak that it raises questions of the Commonwealth's efficacy over time. The liberty to dispute sovereign power, and foreign invasion, of course, or other ways. Now, that's essentially, now, Thomas Hobbes talks about other things in Leviathan, a lot of other things, but those things that we've mentioned really form the basis for understanding what Hobbes is after in the Leviathan. And now he wants to say that, yes, governments can have absolute authority and sovereignty, but that governance is based upon citizens, not God, right? And there is a limit to that governance, right? That governance is limited by the citizens' capacity to consent, right? And there's a number of other features. Now, as you go through the text, you realize you're going to find that Hobbes really offers us a fabulous, insightful, and detailed analysis of the Leviathan and what a society should look like. And we'll see next time in our video when we look at John Locke that John Locke's second treatise on government very much follows in the footsteps of Hobbes, except with Locke we see an increased sort of movement away from monarchy and towards republicanism or democratic forms of government. That's our video for today. Thank you for watching. That's Social Political Philosophy, and I'm Mark Thorsby. I'll see you guys online next time. Bye.